Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight. The regular MLAs were here in at the Legislative Assembly in Committee Room A. We're joined this evening by the Premier and the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs and some of their officials. But to start off the meeting, I'd like to ask MLA Martellus to start with a prayer. Thank you.
So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, then come and offer your gift. Amen.
Thanks, Emily Martellus. Review and adoption of the agenda. The public matters tonight, we're going to get a briefing from our couple of ministers and their officials with regard to GNWT response to flooding. And then we will go in camera for a debrief. And that's the only items on the agenda. Any changes, amendments to the agenda? I think we have one email piece of correspondence that I'd like to suggest we add. Whether we deal with it tonight is another matter, but I'd like to add that to the agenda. So as amended, can I get someone to move the agenda, please? Ms. Cleveland, any objections? No? Okay. Next item, the agenda is adopted as amended. The next item of business, declarations of conflict of interest. Not seeing any. I think we're ready to proceed with the public matters. We have a presentation from, I think it's Honorable Paulie, Chinna, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, and joined by some of her officials and the Premier, Carolyn Cochrane as well. Ms. Chinna, do you have some opening remarks you'd like to make? I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Do we need to introduce ourselves? Yes, okay. Sorry, it's been a while since we've had to do this. Let's just go around and make some introductions so the folks that are watching in particular can see who's in the room here today. And I'll start on my left, please.
Ron Bonnetrus, MLA Decho.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Rylan Johnson, the MLA for Yellowknife North.
Frida Martzellos, MLA for Tabacha.
Caitlin Cleveland, MLA Cam Lake.
Lisa Semler, MLA Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Rocky Simpson, Hay River South.
Jackie Jacobson, MLA Nunavut.
Thanks. We also have some staff in the room. Committee Clerk Michael Ball, our advisor Stephen Dunbar, and our intern James Thomas as well. So thanks for joining us here this evening. I'm going to turn it over to the Minister of Chinna. I believe you have some opening remarks to make. Please go ahead.
He's directing it to me. He's directing it to me for...
Sorry, is it the Premier going to start then with some opening remarks, or is it Minister Chinna?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Premier's got opening remarks. I'll let her go first. Thank you.
Thanks. Premier Cochrane, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Standing Committee for the invitation to brief you on the Government of the Northwest Territories' response to the recent flooding events. With me today are Minister Paulie Chinna, Ms. Laura Garreau, Deputy Minister, and Mr. Ivan Russell, Director of Emergency Management, all with the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. Mr. Martin Goldney, Secretary to Cabinet and Deputy Minister of Executive and Indigenous Affairs, is also in attendance, and my special advisor, Miranda Bai. I know that committee has great interest in the status of the Government of the Northwest Territories response and our next steps to assist the residents of Jean Marie River and Fort Simpson to return to their homes. I'm pleased to let committee know that the disaster assistance policy will be applied to the 2021 flood event, and we will be establishing a territorial disaster assistance committee to begin the detailed work required to review applications for assistance from community governments, businesses, and residents to make a federal claim. If committee is in agreement, Minister Chinna will provide also opening remarks and invite Municipal and Community Affairs staff to provide committee a detailed presentation that outlines emergency management roles and responsibilities, the current status of the flood response, and the government in Northwest Territories' immediate priorities in moving to recovery. Mr. Chair, I'm here on behalf of Cabinet as the Premier, but I'm also here as the Minister of the COVID Secretariat, and as such, the Secretariat did have to work with the emergency response at this matter. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll turn it back to you for Minister Chinna, if you so allow.
Thanks, Premier Cochrane. Minister Chinna, perhaps you can introduce the folks that are in the room there with you, and if you have any opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With me today, I have Ivan Russell. I've got Deputy Minister Laura Grew, and I've got my Special Advisor, Heather Nakiko. Thank you, Premier, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to provide you with an update on the current status of the emergency management work being undertaken by Municipal and Community Affairs. The flooding and the resulting damage that has occurred to date in the Northwest Territories is unprecedented, and it is anticipated that the work to undertake repair and recovery will be lengthy. However, the work required is not new to us. We have dealt with several flooding events in the past, including Nahanni Butte in 2012, Hay River in 2008, Aklavik in 2006, and Fort Good Hope in 2005. I've seen firsthand the impact of the current flooding in Fort Simpson and Jean Marie River. Residents and communities are impacted in a big way and are only now coming to realize the full amount of loss and damage to the property. MACA, through the Emergency Management Organization, was there to support the communities during the emergency response efforts, and MACA will continue to support and assist in their recovery. We have a detailed presentation that will provide information on the structure of emergency management in the Northwest Territories, the approach to the current flood situation, and now that the immediate response is over, what our priorities are as we turn our attention to the territorial approach to assist with recovery. If committee is in agreement, I will ask Ms. Laura Grew, Deputy Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, to provide a presentation. Merci.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. So we have the slides here as well, and maybe I can just ask the presenter to indicate when they'd like the slides to go on to the next one, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Russell and I are going to provide the presentation. Mr. Russell will take committee through the first 14, 15 slides, and then I'll finish it off. Recognizing committee's likely had a long day, we are going to try to get through the presentation in about 15, 20 minutes, but please let us know if you'd like us to slow down or speed up. So with that, I'll ask Mr. Russell to take committee through the beginning of the slide.
Thanks, Mr. Russell. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To start with an overview, we're going to talk about the emergency management structure, roles and responsibilities, some of the current status of the flood season, and some of the priorities. I've included some definitions there on some of the things we might refer to within the presentation. So EMO, Emergency Management Organization, ICS is the Incident Command System, the TPC is the Territorial Planning Committee, the TEOC is the Territorial Emergency Operations Center, and the REOC is the Regional Emergency Operations Center. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Emergency Management Act provides the foundation for emergency management system in the NWT. The Act outlines the duties and responsibilities of the Minister, the Northwest Territories Emergency Management Organization, and community governments in preparing for and responding to emergencies. The Act also provides a state of emergency to be declared should the need arise. The declaration of a state of emergency provides additional powers to the Minister for the duration of the order to deal with an emergency. Similarly, a declaration of a state local emergency by a local authority provides additional powers for the community in dealing with an emergency. Next slide, please. Local authorities. The elected councils of community governments are local authority for the purposes of the Act, and as such are responsible for the development and implementation of community emergency plans to reasonably protect the general public and minimize property damage and loss during emergencies. MACA, through the regional offices, work with communities on an ongoing basis to update and validate community emergency plans and emergency preparedness activities. These plans, the community plans, include considerations for partial evacuation and hosting arrangements within the community. Evacuations outside the community require GWT support and activation of a host community. Next slide, please. The Act is supported by the NWT Emergency Plan, which provides the structure and guidelines for the Government of Northwest Territories and its partners to deal with territorial emergencies and meet a collective responsibility to support communities during emergencies. The plan includes roles and responsibilities of GWT departments and agencies, roles and responsibilities of communities and key partners, a process for requesting federal assistance during emergencies, emergency response management using the incident command system, and evacuation guidelines. The guidelines on community evacuations detail how evacuations are conducted and hosting arrangements for evacuees sent to other communities. The goal of these evacuations is to ensure affected residents are safe and are provided with an acceptable level of care and comfort. The standard arrangement is for group sheltering in the gym, rec center, or school, and with contracted food services. Often during evacuations, we have a number of people who are not able to stay in group shelter environment due to age, health, and other concerns. The reception team coordinating group sheltering assess the needs of evacuees and works to find alternate arrangements for anyone considered vulnerable. Next slide, please. The NWT EMO maintains the Territorial Emergency Operations Center, the TEOC, which can be activated to manage territorial emergencies. The EOC, when operational, provides situational awareness of the emergency preparedness and response planning coordination, and direction and control over EMO emergency response activities. Each region has a similar structure in support of community emergency response activities in their region. Other GWT departments also maintain EOCs to assist in the management of emergencies that fall within their specific mandate. Health and social services around the pandemic, for example, and environment and natural resources in regard to combating wildfires. During an emergency, the NWT EMO works with the EMO group, which includes representation from all GWT departments and agencies, critical infrastructure providers, and other key stakeholders to coordinate emergency response efforts in support of the community. Regional EMOs work with similar groups in each region. Next slide, please. Emergency management in the Northwest Territories is a collective responsibility that relies on participation from everyone, including individuals and families, communities, the territorial government, and other governments. In this diagram, you see at the bottom the individual faced by an emergency, if they need assistance, would look to the community for support. The community, when faced with an emergency, has a community emergency plan, and if they need assistance from the GNWT, would contact the region. The region works under the NWT emergency plan and would provide support to the community. And if the region needed additional resources or assistance, they would look to the territorial EOC, which also works under the NWT emergency plan and provides that support. And if the territory required additional assistance, we could reach out to the federal government or other provinces and territories through either the federal emergency response plan or mutual aid arrangements. Next slide, please. Emergency events are normal in NWT, and many communities and the GNWT have experience in dealing with a wide range of issues. There have been 49 emergency events over the last over the 10-year period from 2009 to 2019. The pictures indicated here are from the 2006 Aklavik flood. The last major event in NWT requiring use of the disaster assistance policy was in 2012 for the Henny Butte flood, which resulted in 11 houses and community infrastructure being impacted and over $2 million claim for federal assistance. Next slide, please. This slide provides a quick summary of the flood situation in NWT, starting at the bottom with Hay River and Katladici First Nation. There's no further flood risks anticipated as breakup has completed. For Jean-Marie River and Fort Simpson, breakup is also complete and no further breakup of flood risk is anticipated. For Toledo, breakup has been completed with no further flood risk expected. Fort Good Hope, breakup continues. Water levels were up 2 meters today with some localized flooding, and evacuation took place of some low-lying areas. In Fort McPherson, breakup is underway. Water levels remain steady at around 9 meters. In Aklavik, we have reports of the ice beginning to break, and today the water levels were up to 13.9 meters. Flood watch is underway and preparedness activities in the community are ongoing. Next slide, please. In general, the current EMO activities related here, monitoring of flood risk, supporting impacted communities, and supporting at-risk communities in their preparedness activity. We've requested federal assistance for use of the rangers to support flood impacted and at-risk communities, and this was approved. And we have this support in place until around the end of June for a 6-week period. Today our key focus is shifting more toward Fort Good Hope and Aklavik in the at-risk communities. Next slide, please. In the South Slave, some of the activities that have been ongoing. Most of the support provided by the South Slave EMO has been in supporting evacuees impacted by the flooding in Fort Simpson and Jean-Marie River. The total number of evacuees provided sheltering in Fort Spith and Hay River from Simpson was around 128. And in Jean-Marie River, evacuees provided shelter in Fort Providence were around 34. Next slide, please. In the day show. On the 19th and 20th of May, the residents were returned to Fort Simpson. Evacuees from Jean-Marie River remain in Fort Providence. And information has been shared with Jean-Marie River and Fort Simpson on disaster assistance policy and moving forward. Next slide, please. In the Sahtu, water levels were up 2 meters today in Fort Good Hope. And some localized flooding, like I mentioned earlier. We have pre-positioned cots and blankets in Norman Wells, and some of them were further sent to Fort Good Hope to support their evacuation plans. And we'll continue closely monitoring that situation through our regional office. Next slide, please. In the Beaufort Delta, we have also pre-positioned blankets to support hosting arrangements in Inuvik should it be required for an evacuation. We understand that ice began breaking there today. The community is on flood watch and posting notices on triggers for evacuation. Indications are that many residents are very reluctant to consider evacuation. Key concern is the runway, which only accommodates small aircraft. However, the community has an air movement plan in place with local airlines to evacuate folks when needed. Next slide, please. At this point, I'll turn it over to our DM.
Thank you, Ivan. So the next series of slides speak to the activity we are currently engaged in now that the community government response to the imminent emergency is over. We are shifting our attention now to transitioning to recovery, and that's the immediate work that we're engaged in right now. One of our big priorities right now is getting information and advice to those residents and community governments who were impacted. So, referring individuals to our regional office, to our website. We've also, late last week and over the weekend, sent out detailed information on the overall disaster assistance process, Q's and A's on the disaster assistance process, and that immediate information for residents to return to their homes. As Mr. Russell mentioned, the demobilization of evacuation centers and return of evacuees has occurred. Where we're really focused right now is we're working to secure private contractors to get in and do the detailed damage assessments that need to be done. We really do need to have folks go into Jean Marie River and Fort Simpson to start that detailed damage assessment work. We're hiring a private contractor. He should be in the community either late this week or early next week. We are working with other partners, other GNWT departments, CERNAC, Housing Corporation, and also Norsix, the company that community governments use for their insurance, to make sure that we're covering all of the assessment work that needs to be done. So that's in process right now. We really need those detailed assessments so that we have some hard numbers on what actually needs to be repaired or replaced. Right now, we do have preliminary information, but until we have those really hard numbers, we don't really know at this point where we need to do emergency repairs, if we need to trigger that process, hire companies right now to do that initial work, or whether it's a longer term repair or recovery reconstruction project. Next slide, please. Another priority is to get the Disaster Assistance Committee up and running. So the Minister of MACA received resolutions on May 18th from Jean Marie River and Fort Simpson for the government to apply the disaster assistance policy to those disasters. So that was received last Tuesday. It was approved on Thursday, and on Friday the Minister provided direction for the establishment of the Disaster Assistance Committee. So where we are with that, we are redeploying an existing MACA staff person to serve as chair of that committee. It will be a committee comprised of all representatives from all GNWT departments, and MACA will be chairing that, and our MACA regional superintendents will also participate on that committee. We are taking a territorial approach to the Disaster Assistance Committee. This is the first time that the GNWT has ever taken a territorial approach versus a regional or community-specific approach, and there's a couple of reasons for that. We know we do have flood damage in at least 2 regions right now, and depending on what happens in the coming week, there may be further communities that experience flood damage or disaster event. We do want to combine all our requests for assistance into one federal claim that we make to Canada. We do want to ensure that those communities who may have experienced smaller dollar amounts of damage are included in our overall GNWT claim. Otherwise, they may have not met the federal funding threshold. And the Disaster Assistance Committee is a fairly significant undertaking. There's a lot of documentation and claim requirements, several audit requirements, and we do think it's more efficient to have one project to tackle this versus having several smaller projects. And we want to ensure that we have consistent application of the disaster assistance claim process from all communities that have been impacted. So the Disaster Assistance Committee will be the body that's established as per the Cabinet Disaster Assistance Policy that will do the detailed work to review applications for assistance. That committee will be the body responsible for developing a standardized item list that we can use to assess claims. That committee will also establish the dates by which applications for disaster assistance must be submitted. It will do things like engage appraisers to do any further work, and it will also determine amounts to be recommended for payment. We do envision the establishment of several working groups. We know that there's several significant issues to address. The claims process, as I already spoke to. We do know there's going to be extensive work required with Canada on such matters as banned housing and other matters. We're not sure yet on where Jean Marie River may be in terms of wanting to be rebuilt. We've seen some reports that may be an option for them, so we will need a whole government response to that. There's things like coordinating any impacts on GNWT infrastructure. So there is a significant amount of work for this committee to undertake. Departments are right now in the process of naming individuals to that committee, and we expect to have the first meeting of it either late this week or early next week. And on slide 17 on the disaster assistance policy. So the disaster assistance policy is purely an assistance program. It's not a compensation or insurance program, and we are having communications with community governments on the nature of the assistance under the policy. It does not provide full reimbursement. Claims are limited to 80% of the total amount of total costs, and there's a maximum amount payable per applicant of $100,000. So as noted, it will be the Disaster Assistance Committee that will be reviewing the claims for eligibility and will be making recommendations. As Mr. Russell mentioned earlier, the policy has been applied to past NWT disasters, and we have received subsequent reimbursement from Canada for our claim. This will be the 6th time since 2005 that the disaster assistance policy has been used by the GNWT. Next slide, please. So while there are several immediate priorities, there are also some longer-term issues that you'll see laid out on this slide. We do need to look at interim and long-term housing solutions for those individuals who cannot return to their home because of the damage that is done. And again, this is the reason we need to get those damage assessments done so that we can do that assessment of how many individuals we're maybe impacted and what those solutions may be. We also, in the longer term, need to continue the work we're doing around supporting communities to access funding, federal funding for disaster mitigation funding, and to assist them in that process. And in the longer term, undertaking and finalizing the claim process with Canada. We anticipate that being a lengthy process. We do need to give people time to assess their damage, to undertake the repairs, to make their claims. We have an extensive review and audit process, and then, of course, to make the recommendations. The claims process, then, when we begin working with Canada, is also a lengthy one, and with significant detail and documentation. However, we are intending to move as quickly as we can on this, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll start that process by getting the Disaster Assistance Committee up and running as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're happy to take any questions you may have.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Garreau. Our usual practice is to have each committee member ask a couple of questions, and maybe we'll try to go through one, maybe two rounds. If there's enough, anyone want to start? Ms. Knockleby, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions, but I think I'm going to start with the comments made around the disaster assistance funding, the program, that it's 80% of the total costs to a maximum of $100,000. Is that a GNWT criteria? I'm assuming, or from what I'm understanding, is we would make a collective claim and then the GNWT would be responsible for doling out that money specifically to groups and individuals in the territory. So I have concerns that people are not going to be able to find the 20% to put their portion forward, given the state of our economy right now and the local economies in those regions. And then, yeah, I guess I'll just start with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. I'm going to turn it over to the Minister, Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Emily Knockleby. Just like any other government funding federal funding that we do receive, there is a percentage that is expected from the territorial government. It's 80%, and then the 20% would be directed to the GWT. But I'll have Deputy Minister Laura Guru elaborate on the response a little bit. Thank you.
Ms. Guru, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the Minister is accurate. Under the disaster assistance policy, the maximum reimbursement is 80% of the total claim, up to a maximum of $100,000. When we put to just some sequencing, some important sequencing. So the Disaster Assistance Committee will do the assessment and make recommendations, and then we will pay out those claims. We do not have to wait for any federal reimbursement to do that process. So the Disaster Assistance Committee will do its work. There will be claims processed and paid out by the GNWT, and then we will take that information and we will submit our claim to Canada for reimbursement from Canada. Canada does not provide full reimbursement to the GNWT. We will not get 100% of our costs back, because as the Minister noted, there is a requirement for the GNWT to also provide assistance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Deputy Minister. Ms. Knockleby, do you have a second question?
Thank you. So that's good. It's not the 20% being put onto the actual person making the claim. It will be the GNWT's portion. So glad to hear that. My next question is around contamination in Jean Marie River. It's my understanding that there has been, this pretty specific, but that there's been a huge amount of fuel contamination in the community. I believe there's an article with the chief stating that if you threw a lit match or a cigarette, the whole place would go up. I just wanted to know if maybe the minister or the department can speak a little bit about how those properties are going to be assessed and whether or not there is going to be an attempt to reclaim or repair homes within that contaminated land, as even if the home is not impacted directly by the fuel spills, I would imagine the surrounding land would be. So I don't know if the department can speak a little bit to that, and I know it's kind of early in the entire assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Emily Knockleby, for your question. According to the assessment that's going to be conducted, the environmental will be included in that assessment as well too. And just for the committee's information as well, like I did travel to Jean Marie River and I did travel to Fort Simpson, and the damages in those communities are quite significant. But our priority is to provide the adequate assistance to making sure that we are having people return to their homes and back to their communities. But it will be a lengthy process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. I've got a couple of others on my list here. And Emily Bonnet-Rouge, you're next, please.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Merci to the Premier and the Minister of MACA and her staff for the presentation tonight. I'm going to start with Katlotechi First Nations. The initial, that's the community in my riding. They were quite pleased with the government, the town of Hay River assisting them in providing notifications. But there was lots of mixed messages also when the town announces that all of KFN should be evacuating when it was only the old village. So they would like to see better communications on that. KFN is well versed in flood mitigation as they have their own flood emergency measures in effect, and they took it upon themselves to accommodate all the residents of the old village into their Dena Wellness Center and provided all the food for them. They didn't have any help from the GNWT at all with those accommodations and for the providing of the food. I'm just wondering if the GNWT had an EMO officer in Hay River to help coordinate with the town of Hay River, West Channel, West Point, and Katlotechi. Merci.
Thanks, Emily Bonnet-Rouge. I'm going to go over to to Minister Chinna, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During this last few weeks, I've been speaking to all of the flood at risk communities. I've kind of established, I guess maybe a committee or a meeting amongst the communities as well. I've been meeting with them 3 times a week since the flooding had happened in Fort Simpson. And working closely as well with Hekladichi and Hay River, they were the first to lift their emergency for flooding. We're looking at, of course, we're going to recognize in a lot of improvements that can be made, and one of it is communications as well. Is that to have communication going out to the communities and the affected residents as well. But we're working to improve that. And also the support for Hekladichi would be the regional MACA office in that riding, and this would be Fort Smith that would have provided the assistance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Chinna. Emily Bonnet-Rouge, do you have another question?
Yes, thank you. Merci, Mr. Chair, and merci for that response. I guess there's lots of complaints about the GNWT being slow to respond to emergencies. I guess they had been telling people to prepare for months in advance, yet they were still slow to respond, and they didn't have all their ducks in a row in terms of setting up disaster sites and providing tents and heat and everything like that. I guess that's the word out there, anyways. But it's nice to see that you've picked up on the lessons learned thing here, and you got a full slate of new rules here. The other thing with Jean Marie River, and probably Fort Simpson, and most likely other communities, is the damages to their units. Like I noticed in one of your policies, you're saying, well, the federal government has to cover somebody. So I'm not sure if it's related to being on Dene band lands or stuff of that nature, because you're separating, the band land from the probably crown land and the funding that would go with it. And it's very hard on the people themselves right now. They're on social media wanting to know why the government is reneging on their word that they were going to provide full assistance to them. As we heard, the contamination in Jean Marie River as a prime example. I'm just wondering what because you're stating in there that you're making leadership. That's probably the chiefs and everybody else. You're making them aware or to understand the disaster assistance policy. I'm not sure what the benefit of that is to make them understand that policy when they're in fact saying that the GNWT is reneging on their probably promise to assist with repairing all the units. What is the criteria to receive assistance under this policy, Masi?
Thanks, Emily Bonnet Rouge. I'm going to turn it over to Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Emily Bonnet Rouge, for your question. And looking at the slow response from the GWT, that I just really want to emphasize that the EMO response at the community level is activated at that level. MACA is on, I want to say, just kind of like on standby until they require our assistance. For an example, when I had went to Fort Simpson, I was told continuously that the community was all right. There was no need for the minister to be entering into their community, and they were functioning, and they're able to handle their and work with their emergency management. And then I had also come to realize that there was a lot of outreach to my office and to myself on social media as well. So I made the attempt to get into the community, inform the mayor, and inform the chief that I will be coming in. There was really they were respectful for me to come in, but they didn't feel that this was the right time. I went into the community anyways, and I saw areas of improvement that we could have recognized immediately. The tent situation and the way that the campsite was set up, it could have been obviously improved. And also looking at additional supports that we could have possibly provided, which I would have liked to see outside residents, outside people coming in and supporting the residents and giving some more relief to the volunteers that were, just leading the emergency management. I noticed that a lot of the team was exhausted, and we could have identified that. I should have went in a lot earlier, but at the request, and I guess maybe the comments or the response from the community is that they didn't want the minister to come in at that time. I came in and I saw room for improvement in how we can better support the community. As for Jean Marie River and looking at the damages for the units, I did get into Jean Marie as well too, and the damages for the units in that community are quite significant. Right now, I've got the Housing Corporation in the community doing our own assessment. As the minister responsible for the Housing Corporation, they are conducting their own assessment so we could forecast what materials and what expenditures this may lead to, and also programming that may be required as well too, and providing repair material, I guess, insulation and I'm not too sure, like for the fuel tank replacement, but once that assessment is done, we'll have a more clear understanding of what actually needs to be completed in that community. And once the disaster assistance for that piece of funding, that is led by the GWT with the information that is provided by the assessment, and both of these initiatives are supported by the department, not led by the community. I hope I answered your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Chinna. I'm going to move on now. We've got Emily Simpson and then Emily Cleveland, but Emily Simpson, if you would like to start now, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the departments for the presentation as well. I guess just thinking back on this and being in Hay River and watching our Community Emergency Management Committee in action. They did a great job. I think partly because they're used to providing. They've been providing this service for a number of years. Not only flooding, probably as well as rescues on the lake and on the highway as well. So they've got the equipment and they've got the staff trained up, and they do they do a good job. But in saying that, what I'd like to talk about as well as communication, because it actually surprised me that watching the news and Facebook and everything else, is that it took the GNWT some time to really acknowledge that flooding was happening in Jean Marie and Simpson, and also the severity of that flooding. And people, the GNWT was actually fortunate that people throughout the NWT jumped in and provided the basic necessities that the communities needed to survive, and that like tents and tarps and food and things like that. And I'm not sure why that happened. The other thing is that it took several days, I think, for a communication to go out publicly, and then another few days before there was a site visit by the minister and as well. It's very important, I think, that there are going to be lessons learned, and I'm hoping that the departments and the government has taken note of what we can do better. When we talk about flooding, we can't just focus on on where the flooding occurs. We've got to look further south. We're getting the waters from BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan coming in. We've got higher water levels. The other thing we got to take into account is Indigenous knowledge as well. On what impacts the flooding, and so those are the type of things I think that we have to really start to look at. And the other thing here now is that the reality here is that the people that have been impacted, a lot of them are going to have limited funds. Any money that they had is probably used up in just surviving this last 2 or 3 weeks. Jean Marie, Simpson, they're you could almost say they're remote in some sense. So it's it takes a little more time to get material and foods in. The other thing is accommodation. Jean Marie, I think people have to, even though it's a small community, it was the whole community that was impacted. So now they've got limited accommodation, and I'd ask, what are we doing to ensure that temporary accommodation is put in place? I know one guy came and I gave him a bunch of plywood and 2x4s so he could build a floor and put a shelter on it, so he had somewhere to, his family had somewhere to live. The other thing is, what financial support, I guess interim financial support, are we providing them as well? And you know, and all, as well, the, you know, the community, you know, they've been impacted through the, you know, the temporary loss of the power station and in the water treatment plants as well. So there's all those things, and you know, and when we talk about, or it was mentioned where, you know, going into Fort Simpson, they said, you know, don't bother coming in. Well, you don't have to. But at the same time, these people that are, you know, the people that are trying to deal with the flooding, they've been personally impacted. And we have to realize that they may not be in the right frame of mind as well. And it's up to us that, you know, we need another party with you know, a new set of eyes to look at what's happening. So, you know, so there's a lot there, and you know, I can go on, but, you know, for me right now, it's, you know, what are we going to do to support them for temporary accommodation and financial support so that they can get by for the next probably several months. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Simpson. As Emily Simpson normally does, he squeezes in about 3 or 4 different questions there, but I'm going to leave it to the Minister Chinna to respond. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Emily Simpson, for your questions. Like, these are questions that have been asked throughout this time as well, and also questions I've asked my department and the community as well. And looking at a response and for the disaster in Fort Simpson, and I know that, you know, as a minister, I should have went in immediately, but, you know, at the request of the leadership at that time, that, you know, they were exercising their emergency management plan and working with our emergency management organization as a GWT, we're basically in support of that community, and also, you know, just I want to say on standby until they want us to be in attendance and want us to start offering that support. But when I got into the community, I quickly learned as well too is that, you know, should I have gotten in a lot more earlier, that maybe the observation of what I could see for improvement could have been would have been needed. And you know, and you're right when you're speaking about the accommodations and the and you know, just the tent setup as well, and looking at, you know, the tents, the heat supply, and you know, we could have worked with the community to offer that support to them and giving them that those suggestions as well too. But you know, what I've also learned is that the emergency management at the community level is led by the community and by the local leadership as well too. And you know, and I wanted to support them as a minister, but when I had went into the community, I seen where areas that, you know, for improvement as well. So I offered the support for the community. Is that one of the things that were identified is, you know, people were in this tent setup area for 7 days. They were needing to shower, they were needing to do their laundry, they were needing just the basic needs. Looking at those circumstances as well too, the weather was quite harsh. It was raining, it was blowing, and you know, it was cold around that time. So I encouraged the residents. I went to go visit them, you know, at each of the tents, and I spoke to them individually and asking them what is it that they would have required, what do they need, and the response that I had received was, you know, they would like to get to a place where they could actually be warm and do their laundry. So, you know, we opened up the evacuation center in Hay River for the individuals to make their way to Hay River. And I think they stayed there for a few days. I'm not too sure of the length. And then the community had requested for them to come back to the community and reside, I guess. But what I was really concerned about is what accommodations that they were returning to. I was advised by the community membership that, you know, this wasn't a concern, and that they basically they had their own plan of the evacuees returning back to the community. And then also for the temporary accommodations, I did meet with the Jean Marie, and, you know, we did have a camp set up as well too at Kelly Lake, and that according to the leadership as well too, that we did we did offer Snowshoe Inn in Fort Providence, so we have residents traveling back and forth. But also, we, according to the chief, that the camp setup was adequate, that he didn't require any additional, I guess, improvements, I guess, that the South Slave environment in our office had set up their camp, according to my last briefing, and that they were able to supply tents and wood stoves and freezers as well, too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. Emily Simpson, do you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess when, as government, we're trying to deal with this as fast as we can. And one of the things that we have to do is determine a minimum value of damage before disaster assistance will be offered. And I guess that scares me when I see that, because, we don't do anything fast. Yet these people are going to be in the communities. Winter is going to be coming here fairly soon, and I'm wondering if we have somebody in the community talking to each individual, because one day I was sitting somewhere and somebody said, well, I've got a couple of $1 million liability, I'm okay. Well, they're not sure what the terms with insurance, like liability is not going to cover them with respect to damage to their building. So I think that's important that we put somebody, a couple of people on the ground to go and talk to these individuals, and if we have to have an interpreter there or somebody to from the community to help them through, and some people may not be able to understand what's happening, others will be able to. So I think it's important that we go in there and we do this right. We have to provide that assistance. We have to make it known what exactly is going to happen. So I guess I'd ask the minister if her department is willing to send somebody into Jean Marie, send somebody into Fort Simpson, like even Hay River, for instance. We've had a couple of tourist operators that had damage to their facilities, and need clean up, and trying to get somebody to talk to them is always tough. And I'd like to see that happen. It shouldn't be a difficult thing. So I'd ask, for a commitment that somebody go in from the department and go through exactly what's going to happen and how long this process may take. So people aren't thinking this is going to, they're going to get an answer tomorrow, because I think they're not going to get an answer for probably, a few months down the road. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Simpson. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Right now, the Housing Corporation is in the community. We have the Assistant Deputy Minister who is meeting with that community leadership as well, and also, most importantly, meeting with the residents to determine, what is going to be required. Also, we do have our infrastructure staff for Northwest Territories Housing Corporation, that these two individuals are traveling together to further provide myself with a preliminary assessment. And also the assessor that has been hired to conduct the assessment for the community, this person will be starting either late this week or early next week. And further to that, with the support of both departments coming in, Housing and MACA, with these supports, we will be able to further determine what is going to be required and how quickly we can get these houses up, and I guess maybe, I'm not too sure if every individual is living in their unit, but trying to work with the unit to try to look at the water damage and how we can further offer material and supplies for these individuals to work on to bring their houses back to standard. I guess, yeah, that's it. I hope I answered your question, Emily Simpson. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. I've got Ms. Cleveland on my list next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My first question is in regards to housing. And we've heard a lot of questions so far about housing. One of the responses from the minister was that the process to return people to their homes would be a lengthy one. And I'm just wondering if the minister is committing to making sure that people are back in their homes before winter. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to work to do this as possible.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That is the goal of the assessment. Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chair. So sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thanks. I've been called worse before. Okay. Emily Cleveland, do you have another question for the minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My second question is in regards to the disaster assistance policies, and it's kind of a two-part question. I'm wondering how people access the funding, if there are people on the ground to help people access the funding for the disaster assistance policy, and if the government will either not only just reimburse people for the money spent, but will actually coordinate paying different suppliers or different contractors required so that people don't have to come up with the money up front and can still access the policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Cleveland. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The disaster assistance policy is reimbursement to the residents in that affected community, but also this is the application is government driven, so the assessment that is is going to be conducted provides that additional information to support that federal application. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Chinna. Anyone else for a second round? I've got, okay, well, Ms. Martsalis, you haven't had an opportunity to ask questions, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank the community of Fort Smith, the EMO and MACA for ensuring that the evacuees were well taken care of by the community, especially the volunteers. There was many volunteers that came forward and made sure that everybody was safe, looked after, fed, clothed. It was incredible. You know, after listening to this presentation, I guess, you know, I'm listening to, I hope that we stay focused on the victims of the flood. It sounds like a lot of bureaucracy. It sounds like we'll get caught up in the bureaucracy and the assessments, and we're still not focused on the victims. I think it's extremely important that leadership plays a role here in ensuring that the bureaucracy is put into place to ensure that the victims of the flood are the focus, and not on fine print and not on the way things are usually done. Because I was sitting here when I first came here, and I was talking about a disaster that happened in Fort Smith when it happened to, I didn't know that they had a disaster assistance policy, and 80% of the amount of eligible costs were available, because that didn't happen with the tornado. And you know, the guy still doesn't have his own house, and he's paying top dollar for going into housing. So you know, we have to make sure that the victims of the flood are looked after first. If we're going to get caught up in bureaucracy, to me, that is not leadership. So, Mr. Chair, I would ask the minister that I hope that leadership prevails here, and that we focus on the victims of the floods. That's my question.
Thanks, Ms. Martsalis. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, the focus are the people, are the victims that have suffered the disaster as well too. But you know, the policy identifies widespread disasters as well, and you know, specifically looking at Fort Smith, that it was one, according to the information that I've received, it was one house that was affected. It wasn't several, and it didn't damage a significant portion of Fort Smith and property. But I will look. I will have my department look at that situation, and I will follow up with the member as well too. And also looking at the focused, looking at our victims and trying to provide adequate assistance to them. Right now, the Housing Corporation has reached out, and I'm just wanting to look at that support that has been provided and at the regional level as well, because we did give direction to the regional offices to be reaching out to the individuals and to the properties that were damaged, but also offering that support that is required. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Chinna. Ms. Marsalis.
Just to follow up to that particular question, I think it's extremely important that the government of the Northwest Territories shows leadership to ensure that the focus must be on the victims of the flood, because I know exactly what happens. It gets caught up in bureaucracy. Winter will be coming, and these people are not going to be in houses or have adequate needs that are regular needs of a family. And it's, and they're going, we're going to look at it again, and we're going to be questioning this, and I don't want to be doing that. I want to make sure that the leadership is in place to make sure the focus is on the victims of the flood. Is that going to happen? And I also want to ask, how long has this disaster assistance policy been in place? Has it been, the whole process with the policy, has it been reviewed so that it's less bureaucratic and more on leadership? That's very important to me, because I know how it feels when a victim of a disaster comes to you and there's no response. You can't get a response from no one. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Marsalis. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the policy was revised in 2005, but I'm not too accurate on the specific date that we had activated that or have had that within the Northwest Territories. I will follow up with the member on the specific date. And also, I am committed to making this approach client service and victim service as well too, and provide that service to the victims and making sure that adequate housing is fulfilled. And I will making sure that we do have houses and accommodations provided to the individuals before the winter months. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. So I think we've come to end of the first round. I've got 3 on my list for a second set of questions. And Ms. Knockleby, you're first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did neglect to thank everybody for their presentations when I went first, so thank you for that. I have a ton of questions, so I think I'm going to end up following up with the department outside of this, but I wanted to just reiterate some of what my colleagues have said about bureaucracy and these assessments. I'm really also concerned that we're going to get bogged down in doing this work and then not actually have people in housing for come winter time, and even without the harshness of the winter climate, the north is tough, and I want to see people in proper housing now, not even waiting until they're freezing to make that the priority. I guess I have one suggestion there is that there are a lot of expediters and logistics companies in the north that could be utilized to provide camp settings. They have ATCO trailer camps. I'm sure there's people in this room that might have a couple. So those could be leased or rented from those private businesses in order to house people temporarily until such a time as the housing can be done. I'm also concerned, I heard someone say there was one assessor or one company that was being used to do assessments. That seems really slow. I'm also concerned about the discrepancies in the assessment process. One company will do one assessment, the next company is going to come in and do another. We don't have a ton of super sophisticated hazardous materials type companies in the north necessarily, or it's a burgeoning industry in the north and hasn't always been done right. So I have a lot of concerns around one assessor, one company, or even just a couple, that getting overwhelmed, getting bogged down in bureaucracy as well and not getting forward. I guess other things I'd like to comment to be considered is the rising costs of construction. We're already seeing, sheets of plywood I thought I heard was $95 $100 or something, and somebody told me they paid $30 for one piece of lumber the other day. So I'm wondering if this $100,000 limit is even remotely going to be enough when you look, or 100,000, then you look at the housing work we've been doing says that houses are already in need of $100,000 to $150,000 worth of repairs each. Now we have flooding and assessments on top of that. So I guess where I'm going with this is I see this becoming a really big snowball of all of the issues impacting from the pandemic to construction to the economy to logistics. And I just don't see this being very realistic that these people are going to be in houses. So I guess I strongly encourage that we look at the camp logistics companies to see if they can provide some of that. And then I guess my question is, are there lessons learned being done? Are you learning things right now on Jean Marie River and Fort Simpson that you're now turning around and applying to places like Aklavik and Fort Good Hope, which are still on the verge and are still in flood watch? And was there lessons learned done around the 2006 Aklavik flood, I believe it was mentioned? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Knockleby. There was a lot there, so Minister Chinna, and of course, look, the House starts sitting in a couple of days, and I expect that this will be a hot topic in the House, but Minister Chinna, if you'd like to try to respond to some of that now, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was trying to take notes as MLA Knockleby was speaking, and I'm quite concerned as well too for the assessments to be done, and I needed making sure that they are done accurately. But not only that that we do have material and supplies that are ready to go in the community. The other thing that I'm looking at is the cost for the material for the individuals. For their repairs, and then also looking at what the village of Fort Simpson and the community of Jean Marie River, the cost and the expenditures that they have endured during this time as well, and that I've asked Fort Simpson to start gathering and putting together a document so I could take a look at their expenditures to date as well, but. Looking at the camp setting, I just, I would like to explore that idea as well too, because, with, we are, operating within COVID right now, and looking at materials to get into the Northwest Territories, but not only that, to get workers to get this work done and get these houses repaired. That I don't want to see any delay in that delivery as well, but I appreciate MLA Knockleby's comments as well, and I would like to follow up with her as well, because looking at with her expertise as well too, and her field and her background as well, that at this time that I would find it quite beneficial in order for us to really look at how can we look at these units and have people returning to their homes in more of a effective, timely manner, I guess. But I'm committed to having these people back and returned into their homes by the winter months. Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. MLA Knockleby, do you have another question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The minister's kind words will get her a very short comment from me, since I crammed it all into my first one anyway. I'd be more than happy to meet with you, and I guess I'll just put in a plug here that there are a lot of northern businesses that could be of a lot of help here that potentially might have slow seasons coming up. So yeah, I just again wanted to plug in for making sure that if we are bringing in assessors and contractors and such, that we're ensuring they're northern owned and Indigenous businesses if we can. Thank you.
Thanks. Minister Chinna, do you have a response?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The comments are appreciated, and I will be reaching out to MLA Knockleby. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. I've got MLA Norn has joined us a while back, and I just want to go to him for questions, and then I'm going to go back to MLA Bonnet Rouge and MLA's Bonnet Rouge in Cleveland. So, MLA Norn, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that presentation. Joining in a little bit late. And I just, my heart goes out to, people out in the Dead Show in Fort Simpson. I got a lot of relations there, got a lot of calls, and, it was good to see the outpouring of support from businesses from all over North to chip in, and that was good to see. That's true North spirit. Whenever something bad like this happens, we pull together, we band together, we work together, and by saying that, we need to have, like everybody, including the GNWT, need to pitch in always. Every one of us, every little bit helps, But I don't want to make a quick question. I had a quick question for Minister Chinna. In my riding, Little Buffalo River, just outside of Denis-Nouquin, they have several year-round residents that live there, and they experienced some flooding there as well, and they have their homes damaged. So are they going to be part of this? Will they be eligible for this disaster program? Merci, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Norn. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to confirm, yes, Little Buffalo River will be included in the application for the disaster funding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. Emily Norn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Further at this time.
Okay, thanks, Emily Norn. We'll go back to Emily Bonnet-Rouge, please.
Let's see, Mr. Chair. My question at the outset was just for public knowledge. I was hoping that someone could explain the criteria for the disaster assistance policy. For people to receive assistance. If we could try to clarify that. Also, you stated that you only now have an assessor to assess the homes. About a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, there was all the news that assessments were being done on the homes in the communities. So now we've got a lag of, we're going to have a lag of perhaps over a month or two, or to have another assessment again. I'm just wondering, for the residents' sakes in the communities that are impacted, how long do we anticipate a report from the assessor? Merci.
Thanks, Emily Bonnet-Rouge. Mr. Chinna, so there's a couple of questions there about if someone can explain the criteria for the disaster assistance policy, and how long is it going to take to get the assessor's report? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to really confirm as well too. I just don't want the public and also the members to get confused with the assessments. The assessment that I had requested was the Housing Corporation to get into the communities and to provide us something to work with. I needed to understand and needed to see that how many houses were affected and how many houses may need to access the Housing Corporation programs that we currently do offer. And the assessment that for the disaster application, that is for the federal funding going forward. And that assessment is more thorough because it is a federal ask, and it's going to be one ask for the territorial government, as including all of the affected communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Minister Chinna. Emily Bonnet-Rouge, I hope that helped, but no further questions? Okay, thank you. Emily Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to come back around to the disaster assistance policy, and then I promise to let it go, and I'll follow up with emails if I don't get my way. I just wanted to come back around because I'm listening to what MLAs are saying that were directly impacted by communities that experience flooding, and the requests there are to make sure that people have the funds they need in order to put their lives back together, and that we as a government treat people as that we capitalize on the fact really that we are a small jurisdiction and that we can do case by case customer service with the people of the Northwest Territories. So what I'm asking is if the minister will evolve the disaster assistance policy to make sure that they're able to work with people to access the funding dollars up front rather than a reimbursement, because I think a reimbursement unfortunately really isn't an equitable way of going about it, because what that ends up saying to people is if you have disposable funds or if you have access to a loan, then you can access the disaster assistance policy, but unfortunately not everybody has that opportunity, and so I'm asking the government to acknowledge that and to amend the policy to reflect that. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Cleveland. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to have the Deputy Minister Laura Guru answer that question, just because it's kind of confusing with the disaster, the application, the assessment, and you're looking at the funding that is provided as well too. So I'll just have her give a short explanation on where we are at right now and what we're requiring. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead. Thanks, Mr. Chinna. Go ahead, Ms. Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the disaster assistance policy that we have in place, it's partly constructed to ensure that we can maximize our opportunities for reimbursement from the federal funding program. And I may turn it over to Mr. Russell to talk more about the federal funding programs, but those federal funding programs are designed, they are assistance programs. It's not a full reimbursement program, and it's not an insurance program. So it does recognize that, this is the federal program, it does recognize that disasters are unanticipated and produce wide-scale damage and have very negative consequences on people, but it is assistance to get residents and communities back to a pre-disaster state. There is as we talked about, there is a element to it where provinces and territories do have to provide some assistance as well. But in order for the GNWT to tap into that, like to be eligible for the Disaster Financial Assistance Program, we have to ensure that the policy is structured so that we actually meet Canada's eligibility. So we are, there is definitely room for us to look at the disaster assistance policy and update it. It was last revised in 2005. And that is on our list of things to look at, in the nearer term once we're done dealing with the current flood season. But we would need to take some caution around altering it so that we are not eligible to be reimbursed. Otherwise, the GNWT would be required to fund 100% of the costs. And I hope I didn't confuse folks more, but I'm happy to answer more questions on that or ask Mr. Russell to provide some information on the structure of the federal funding programs. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Minister. Ms. Cleveland, anything further?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. No, I understand that sometimes the federal government structures their programs in ways that really doesn't work for the North. We've seen that in many different departments and with many different programs. And I don't know if this is a case where, you steal from Peter to pay Paul, and steal's a bad word, but where you use something like income assistance in order to fund projects or something like that, and then it's reimbursed, and it's the government passing money back and forth between the left hand and the right hand in order to make sure that constituents are getting the assistance that they need. But my concern here is just that people who need the funding won't have access to it because they don't have the financial means in order to put the money out up front. That's my concern. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Cleveland. Maybe I'll just reframe this a bit. So can someone clarify, do people actually get the assistance, the financial assistance under this policy up front, or do they have to spend the money first and then get reimbursed? Can someone tell us that?
Spend it and get.
Please go ahead, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the funding provided, it's we're working with it that we're not wanting the residents to pay for the damages up front. We're wanting to work with the disaster policy to making sure that how can we work with that? This is why I've asked the Housing Corporation to come in as well to try to provide and alleviate and that burden and also that assistance that may be required. We're trying to be very strategic in the response here because we're talking about a whole community, two whole communities that had significant, massive damage to them as well too, and looking at the repairs. Are we able to get the repairs done and build a whole community within the next 3 months? It's going to be very challenging. So looking at what we could further provide as a government to these communities is what I would like to see and if we're able to provide the renovations and the adequate housing needs through the Housing Corporation, we're willing to work with Municipal and Community Affairs as well. I hope that answers your question, but right now, before the assessment is not completed, it's really hard to make that determination right now. So it's just, in the time being, I have the Housing Corporation going in and looking at the significant damages and wanting to really emphasize on the programming that we do have to try to alleviate that burden. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. I'm not sure we're really getting to the bottom of this, and I suspect you're going to get some questions on this on the floor of the House. But I've got Emily Johnson. You haven't had a chance to ask any questions, and I know, Ms. Martellus, you're on my list, but I'm going to let Emily Johnson go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to everyone for all their work to date. I guess I recognize the limitations of the disaster assistance policy. I know a number of municipalities have tried to access it before, and the federal government has put some very tough limitations on getting that. And I get that we have to go through that process, and we'll work with community governments to get their money, and the Housing Corp will work to do the units. But I guess I'm still very confused about how the disaster assistance policy applies to residents. If I'm a person in Fort Simpson and I want to start rebuilding my house, perhaps there was a bunch of damage to my property, and I have $100,000 worth of remediation to my house to do. What should I do right now? Should I start spending that money and send invoices to someone in MACA? Do I send that to someone in my community government? Do I go to the federal government? Am I waiting for someone to write me a check? I just actually, throughout this whole presentation, don't understand what the people on the ground should be doing in order to get money. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson. I think you hit the nail on that. Minister Chinna, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Right now we're looking at, should the individuals start renovating their units and collecting the receipts? If that's the way to go. But the other thing is that we do have low-income families that are not able to afford those renovations and those materials that are required to rebuild their homes. So in that case, that is why the Housing Corporation is in the communities to look at further programming to try to alleviate that burden. But looking at the funding that is there, the policy that is there as well, the application that we're trying to submit, we're trying to find and be strategic about how can we have the clients reimbursed, how can we get them reimbursed, and how can we provide assistance to get these houses up to standard. But I don't want to weigh too heavy on the assessment, but this is where the assessment is key right now because it does provide and complete the application to the federal government. But in the time being, the Housing Corporation is in the community once again. And I know it's not a clear answer for MLA Johnson as well too, but this is a really different approach. And I'm not talking about just a section of a community. I'm talking about the whole community of Simpson and Jean Marie River, and and we're trying to find ways where we can eliminate where they would have to be paying for the renovations up front. Nobody, I'm not too sure, does anybody have $50,000 that is sitting there that is committed to renovations? this community has suffered significantly with the traumatic effect of the flood to begin with, and it's just I really take that thought into consideration as well, in the state of the community as well, and really trying to find between both portfolios as a minister responsible for the Housing Corporation and MACA, how can we alleviate those burdens until we actually have the assessment completed, done, submitted, and looking and waiting for the funding to be allocated to the Northwest Territories. Long answer, but I hope you were able to get something out of that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Emily Johnson, for your question.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. I'm not sure we're getting the level of detail that we're looking for, but I'm going to let Mr. Johnson decide whether he needs to ask another question, so go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and I understand we're going to make an application to get reimbursed from the federal government, but I'd also like to get the figure that MACA has in regards to what we are going to spend before we have to, whether you have to get more approval from the legislature. I know MACA doesn't actually have millions of extra dollars in their budget, and this is clearly a multi-million-dollar problem. And I guess my other recommendation is navigating housing in the Decho, in a good year is extremely difficult, and it's overcrowded and it's difficult. Navigating income assistance in a good year is next to impossible for a lot of people. I think people need some money in hand now. I've been talking to people and they've been struggling to get groceries and they've been relying on volunteer efforts, but I would encourage our emergency powers exist to perhaps kill some of the bureaucracy that, perhaps we can prioritize wait lists for housing. Perhaps we can bring in mobile units. We probably should payroll a number of the income assistance people so they're not having to worry about filing paperwork to get checks to live while their community is destroyed. So I guess to date, I think the emergency powers have not been utilized to the extent, and we've been relying on volunteers, and I would encourage the minister to look at the scope of powers that she currently has to remedy that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Johnson. I'll turn it over to Minister Chinna for comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know that the questions that you're asking, it's a very complicated process, I want to say. But the other thing is that we don't have emergency management funding that is sitting there. Like the department doesn't have $5 million, $3 million set aside to deal with these kind of situations. We heavily rely on the disaster application and the funding from the federal government. But this is something that I would like to look at as well going forward, and maybe it's something that we need to throw in our budget, is to put an extra additional $2 or $3 million in our budget to look at circumstances and try to carry us up until we actually receive an approval of the application prior to the assessment being completed. But until then, that all receipts are to be received to the department, so we can work with that and look at the assessment and include that in the application. But currently, right now, our department is not budgeted to have that funding to carry us up until the disaster application is hopefully approved and we're able to access funding through the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Chinna. I'm sorry, I've got Emily Marcellus on my list, and I know it's getting kind of late. If no one else has any questions, okay, I've got Emily Simpson as well. Ms. Marcellus, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the government of the Northwest Territories has an assessor that's going to go in. The assessor knows nothing about the people in those areas, their lives and how they lived and their traditional way of doing things. And so who helps the victims of these floods to help them navigate the application so that they get the best deal possible for the flood victims under the disaster assistance policy? That's my question.
Thanks, Ms. Marcellus. I'll turn this over to the Minister. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The assessor that has been hired had actually worked with Nahanni Butte and restoring their community. So, they'll be conducting the assessment, and also with the support of the MACA Regional Office to conclude the assessment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. Emily Martellus.
I don't think, Mr. Chair, I don't think my question was answered. Yes, we have to have the assessor there. I understand that for representing the government of the Northwest Territories. Who gives, helps the actual person that's filling out the application for damages to their property, so to navigate the application through the best process possible for a best deal possible for the flood victims? Like, we're going to be, the assessor goes in, is going to make sure that they're getting the lowest possible assessments so that whatever happens, it's going to, we have to make sure that that our focus stays on the flood victims and not on the assessor, not on recovery is very sensitive. Sensitive so much so that I had someone call me today from Calgary who went through the whole thing in Calgary and the reserve just south of Calgary, telling me of all the recovery was worse than everything else, because there's so much feelings and emotions when you go back. And I really think that the government of the Northwest Territories, I encourage them to ensure that there's someone there looking after the interests of the victim in this flood. When they go, they're going to have the assessor, but someone's got to advise the victim and do the process properly. There's always two sides to the story. Or we're just going to go the same old way again and dictate what's going to be, and that's it. Because there's going to be a lot of backlash with some of those things if we don't do it properly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Martellus. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The department is one of the smallest departments within the GWT, and looking at the supports for this position. For the assistance and for individuals to apply for this funding. This will be directed in the responsibility of the regional superintendent in each of the regional offices, and I know that this is out of the ordinary for this responsibility to be, carried and given over to the regional superintendent. But we don't have regional emergency management officers in the smaller communities. In the regions. So at this time, the responsibility will be given to the regional superintendent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Minister Chinna. Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the disaster assistance program, it's not intended, we know that, for full compensation. So if anybody's expecting to be fully compensated for any damage, they're out of luck. And there's also a number of areas that, that kind of mitigate what the program will pay. And that's, for instance, if there's insurance, they're going to be looking at that. If something could be recovered through legal action, they'll be looking at that. There's a number of things that have to be taken into consideration. And I suspect that the assessor isn't going to be the one that tells the victim that that's actually, in place. So I think it's important. I think what's being said here is, are you going to put a navigator in? Somebody who can navigate housing, can navigate income support, who can, that knows the community, that kind of knows the people. It's kind of like I guess when I look at myself kind of in Hay River, that's kind of the job I do as an MLA. I provide that service. People come in and I've got to kind of deal with all the departments. I think every MLA here does that as well. So, that's what we're asking, I think, is how are we going to let the people know what their rights are? What are the options available to them? And to do that, we need somebody in there. And, you know, it's plain and simple. We had no problem hiring 160 people for COVID. Like, there was no problem. And now we've got two communities that are devastated, and we're, you know, well, we don't have enough people to do this and enough people to do that. Well, you know what? That's kind of, you know, that it's just not right. And they've got to be looked after as well. So I guess the question I have, you know, is the department or is this government willing to put somebody in, a few people in on the ground to support the individuals that are there? Because if they're not, those individuals will be calling us for that support. And, you know, we did, like I said, we did it for COVID, so I see no reason why we don't do the same thing for the victims of the flooding. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Simpson. I'm going to turn it over to Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just very, very quickly that, you know, I have the department looking internally as well that, you know, if we do have any vacant positions that have not been filled and that they would be able to carry on the responsibility. But right now, the responsibility lies with the regional superintendent. And I know this is for them to look at and help the individuals complete the applications. But that's just a temporary solution right now. But we are looking internally to see how we can fund this position and making sure that we get the applications completed and they are adequate for submission. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Minister Chinna. Emily Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess, you know, we're talking about doing assessments and you know, trying to get money to the individuals. And you know, I would tell those individuals, those victims, don't spend your money, because if you spend your money, you're not going to get it back. That's happened in Hay River before, and more than likely it's going to happen here. It may not say that in any of these documents, but that's more than likely what's going to happen. So I just wanted to make that comment. But I guess the question I have is, like we are talking about assessments. We're talking about, you know, helping the victims, making them, you know, helping them understand the process. You know, if there's any appeal processes as well. But what I'd like to ask is, as we're going through this, what are we doing? Are we doing something parallel to look at, you know, how we mitigate future flooding? Like, does that, like, there's been discussion out there about possibly moving the community of Jean Marie or some of the houses to higher ground. Well, we did that in Hay River in 1963 from the old town to the new town. Well, you go to the old town and it's full of houses, and we run into the same problem. So, you know, I think that, you know, if you want lessons learned, there's lots of lessons, you know, from the past. And I think if we revisit some of that stuff and see what happened, I think hopefully we can do something a little better here. Because, you know, if I was in Jean Marie, I know I'd want to be on the river. And how do I do it? You know, do I put pilings in the ground and put my house up higher? Well, if I have to do that, that's what I'll do. So I think that it's important that as we're going through this one process, we have to have a parallel process, which is how do we mitigate this in the future? We don't want to go and spend a whole bunch of money, you know, and I don't think the victims want us to spend a whole bunch of money fixing up a house that maybe next year is going to go through the same thing again. So as we're doing that, we have to do this other process, and that's going to take time. So I'm not sure if you guys looked at that, but you know, if it was me, that's something I'd be looking at. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Simpson. Minister Chinna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, we've identified the need for a position to oversee and for them to look at the disasters within the Northwest Territories, but not only specifically for this situation, but all of the flood at risk communities as well. Looking at the climate change throughout the Northwest Territories, how are these communities going to be affected? What are they going to look like in the next few years? And not only that, you know, if there's an opportunity and the community is wanting to relocate, this position would navigate the community on how to pursue and how to get this done. And there has been conversations as well too with the Department of Lands at the deputies table to look at that as well. I want to speak about Jean Marie, where I did bring this up to the chief as well, and looking at a relocation, and if they were to start reconstruction and building and replacing some of the units, I was not wanting to put them back into the community where they had been affected by the flood, and wanting to move them to higher ground. So within a department, we are looking at like strategies like this and looking at positions like this. And we actually have identified a person that would be starting with us very soon. Very shortly, and also looking at the disasters committee as well too, to help us further these applications going forward, seeing them to approval, and also looking at what do we need to plan for as a government when we're looking at climate change and looking at the affected communities that would be involved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry.
Thanks, Minister. I don't see anybody else on my list, so I've got a few comments here and one question if I can. Minister, I think you're hearing a fair bit of frustration from us in not getting answers, or specific enough answers, or detailed enough answers. And if we're not getting them here, I hate to think what it's like for folks on the ground who are struggling trying to put food on their table, get their houses fixed up, deciding whether they're going to stay in Fort Providence for the summer. We need a lot more specificity here to the answers, and you need to have somebody on the ground to help navigate all of these kinds of services that cut right across the government, not just the Housing Corp or assessing damage so that we can get an application into the federal government. I guess if I was in your shoes, I'd be looking at modular homes, camps, anything to get those people back into their communities as quickly as we can. And you've now said that that's going to happen before winter sets in. We're going to hold your feet to the fire on that. One of the issues, though, is that this disaster assistance program is like a program of last resort. If you don't have insurance, you can't get somebody else to pay, then you may get some assistance. I'll be astounded if people can actually get insurance in Jean Marie River. I've been after this government now for years about finding ways to provide insurance for people in small communities. Anyways, a lot of frustration, I think, that you're hearing from us as MLAs, and I expect that this is going to carry forward into the sitting. But I would like to know whether we can expect to see a supplementary appropriation to help with the basic needs for these people in the communities. So are we going to see a supplementary appropriation request for some kind of interim emergency assistance? If not, I really suggest that you think carefully about that. I know a lot of work has to go into putting together the claim for the federal government, but people cannot wait that long. So are we going to see something in the supplementary appropriations for emergency assistance for some of these individuals who need help right now? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and absolutely, yes, the submission is, we are looking at that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair, sorry, Mr.
Okay, thanks for that. I guess I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you on behalf of the committee for appearing before us this evening. Any closing comments from the Premier and or the Minister? All right, if we're not going to get any closing comments, thank you very much. Okay, well, do you have comments, Minister?
So Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't realize the volume was off, and thank you. I just wanted to thank committee as well too. And I know this is going to be a lengthy process. This is going to be something different as well with this government. But I could just reassure you that we do have other plans and conversations going on behind the scenes, and you will see some changes as we go forward and improvements. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister. I'll turn to the Premier. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to make? Premier Cochrane. I think you're muted. We're not hearing anything here. We're just going to check with our technical folks here for a minute. Premier, would you like to try again? I don't think it's anything at our end that we have any control over. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, we were not able to hear the Premier. All right, thanks everybody for your appearing before us this evening. I'd like to get a motion from committee to move in camera. Ms. Knockleby, any objections? Not seeing any, so we're going to go in camera, but we're going to call a break for a few minutes while we end the broadcast. And I'd ask Emily's to stay here for a few minutes afterwards. Thank you. But thanks to everybody for watching this evening as well.